work a lot with Nancy on copyright advisory work and litigation, and working with Michaela as well on pre-publication review and counseling.
And I'm Michaela. I am not a litigator. I work on the transactional side, and I do a lot of content review. I work with individual creators, producers, distributors of content, from written content to visual or audio content, analyzing it for things like fair use, copyright, risk. Yeah. So first we'll go through sort of the fair use basics, what is and is not fair use. We'll talk a little bit about the practical aspects of a fair use review, in particular the importance of insurance and the role of lawyers in helping to secure that insurance. And then we'll go through some case studies, some hypothetical scenarios, and discuss whether or not we think that that is a case for fair use. So fair use basics, Scott.
Right, thank you. So Michaela mentioned we'll talk about what fair use is and isn't. The one thing it isn't is a verb. So you can't fair use something. It's not just a black and white kind of thing that you can or can't do. It's almost always a fact-intensive analysis, and will depend on the circumstances of any given piece of content or type of use. Just as some background, fair use started as a judge-made essentially exception to licensed use of copyright materials. In 1978, it was codified into the Copyright Act, and now it sits at Section 107 of the Copyright Act. It's got 4 factors that are non-exclusive, but almost every case that you'll see goes through the 4 factors and doesn't often add much to it, with the exception of the first factor, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'll just back up a second and just say that, give our standard disclaimer that the things we're talking about here today are our personal opinions and thoughts and don't necessarily reflect the views of our firm, our partners, our clients, et cetera, et cetera. So there you have it. Going back to the fair use test, there are 4 factors. They are generally weighed by courts when deciding whether something is or is not a fair use. And essentially what fair use amounts to is an exception to licensed use. It's a permitted use without permission. It's often categorized as a defense. Technically, when you're in a litigation, you refer to fair use as a defense, but it really is it's a doctrine in and of itself. It's a carve out of the Copyright Act to kind of promote the goals of the Copyright Act of encouraging creativity and creation of new works and using others' works for influence and inspiration. And it also is kind of the First Amendment safety valve to the Copyright Act. Copyright confers a limited monopoly on creative materials, but there has to be some flexibility to satisfy the First Amendment's protection of free expression. So in order to determine whether something falls within this carve-out, the first factor is the nature of the use. So really what this started out as is an analysis of whether the use was commercial or non-commercial. The first factor has been augmented in recent years. It started in the 90s with a Supreme Court case dealing with Two Live Crew's rap version of Roy Orbison's Pretty Woman. And this concept of transformation was built into the first factor. So the purpose and character of the use is not only whether the use is commercial or non-commercial, it is whether it was transformative. It's a word that doesn't appear in the Copyright Act, but has been the focus of courts as kind of the most heavily weighed factor for a long time, whereas it used to be one of the other factors, which I'll get to in a second. Transformative use means you add some expression or commentary, or are using a work in a new way that wasn't necessarily contemplated by the original user. It's very fact-specific, and it's a go-to for people who want to use copyrighted works will say, well, this is transformative. Just because you use it in a different format or comment on it doesn't necessarily mean it's transformative. It's a very, very nuanced analysis. So that's kind of been the biggest point of controversy and the biggest focus of courts in recent years. I'll jump to the fourth factor because that's generally seen as historically was the most important factor, and now is kind of coming back into vogue after the transformative use analysis has kind of been exhausted. And that's the effect on the market. So if an unlicensed use supplants a licensed use and usurps the market, that would weigh against fair use. The second factor is essentially how much of is the nature of the work that's being used. Is it more factual or is it more creative? And that, I think, would be an important distinction in the documentary world, whereas it's generally not seen as a deal breaker in the actual analysis that courts undertake. And then the third factor is how much of a work you use as compared to the whole thing. And obviously, the less that you use, the more that factor would weigh in favor of fair use. But again, there's no magic percentage. It's not like I can use 5 or 10% of a particular work and it'll be fair use. That's not really how it works. So those factors are weighed and analyzed by courts to come to a very fact-specific determination.
Great. So another important thing in the third factor, in the amount and substantiality, there's other issues that we think about that are a bit outside of fair use, things like when something is so little that it might not register at all in the analysis. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So that's the concept of de minimis use. It folds into the third factor a little bit because, as I mentioned, you have a stronger argument for fair use the less of material you use. But there is a point at which the use becomes so small as compared to the entire work that you're sampling from, using sampling for lack of a better word, that it essentially, as a legal matter, it can't be substantially similar to the work that allegedly is infringed. So it's a little hyper-technical, but it's easier just to say that it's so small that it almost doesn't matter.
I think sometimes the courts just call it, it's so trivial that it is almost like not worthy of even being raised.
Right.
Yeah.
It's I think a rare defense. It's come more into focus in recent years in cases dealing with screenshots. We litigated a case dealing with a video where a screen grab of one frame of the video was used in a news article. It was deemed to be fair use because we were commenting or criticizing on the video itself. But we also received a ruling on de minimis use in that one frame is 1/30th of a second, and as compared to a 45-minute video, it was just too small to be considered infringing. So that's something to consider. It doesn't necessarily mean a screen grab of a video will always be fair use. I'll put that caveat out there, but that is another defense that's related to fair use.
Or if you're looking at some motion video where something's in the background, it could be so out of focus or fleeting that it could be considered de minimis as well.
Great. So in conducting a fair use analysis in a documentary film, let's talk a little bit about the role of attorneys in that work. One thing that is really important when you're creating a film and then seeking distribution of it is the insurance factor.
Okay. Right. So I think there's people in the room because there's such bright lights in my eyes, I can't see anything, but documentarians are storytellers, and documentaries generally, talk about events, people, things from a historical, cultural, or biographical nature, and there's always going to be some material that you may want to use. It could be family photos that someone has given, works in a historical archive, old letters, but materials where clearance could be very difficult for many reasons. There's this notion called orphan works, where some work is likely in copyright, but you either can't locate the owner or you don't know who the owner is. At one time, there was a proposed amendment to the Copyright Act that if you did a diligent search, and did not come up with a copyright owner, your remedies would be limited if you use the work in something such as a documentary film. That law never passed, mostly because of the issues with the fact that most visual works are born orphaned because there's no credit required in our Copyright Act anymore. So that kind of stalled. That would have been something really helpful. But in order to distribute a film at one time, if you had works that weren't clear, it'd be very, very difficult to get insurance. And that would really curtail storytelling, because there were a lot of works that would just have to be eliminated, but could be really important in the documentary and the story you're telling, and would really be extremely low risk. So their insurance companies started allowing a fair use rider, where if you had lawyers review a film and give an opinion on the risk of any uncleared material, whether it fell under fair use or was out of copyright or could even be de minimis, then you could still get insurance if you had lawyers who were qualified in this area write a fair use opinion letter. So now most films will require or will have a lawyer review it and go through a clip log and give an opinion as to the risk of something being protected by copyright or not, or having an exception under fair use. So the role of a lawyer has become much more important in obtaining insurance for these kind of films.
Great. So why don't we go through some hypothetical scenarios of a client coming into the office wanting to make a documentary film, and we can talk about whether or not the material that they want to use may or may not be fair use. So let's start here, Nancy. Your client comes into the office. They want to make a short documentary about protests that have happened around the election. And they found clips on YouTube from a bystander who was present at the protest. Mm-hmm. What kinds of questions and considerations would you make?
Okay. Well, whenever you're doing any fair use review, as Scott said, it's very facts intensive. So it's context. So you can't have the client just show you that 2 seconds they want to use. You really need to review enough of the documentary and the sequence to see why this clip was important and how it's going to be used, because those facts are very important. And I can't tell you how many researchers find everything on YouTube and then say, let's try to clear all this, or can I fair use everything? But if you're looking at a protest and there was a YouTube clip from a bystander, first it's probably going to be someone who may or may not be professional. There's lots of iPhone uses out there. And you have to look at how it's being used. Are you commenting on the fact that this video was taken? Is the fact that that video exists, something that is newsworthy in itself? If you're using any kind of content in a documentary just really for the same purpose it was created for, the illustrative value, if you just want to sort of fill in with visual background, that would sort of lean against fair use. But suppose this is the only video out there that shows this protest existed, and maybe someone was disputing that anyone showed up. You might have a real value of showing this video to contradict some news reporting saying that no one was there. So you really do need to look at the context, and there's no black and white, let a YouTube clip is good, or you can use 2 seconds. But again, I would always say use as little as possible. And if you can, locate the owner of it, see if you can get permission.
And in that same vein, Scott, so let's say your client finds a video on Facebook that's gone viral and wants to do a story about that video itself.
So fair use is the preamble of Section 107 of the Copyright Act lists some illustrative uses that are kind of almost presumptively fair. I wouldn't say there's a presumption of fair use on anything, but some of the key examples are commentary, criticism, news reporting, parody, that kind of thing. And some of that language is right in the statute. When a video goes viral and the story is about the video, and essentially the video is the story being told. Reporting on that or documenting the fact that this video exists tends to lean in favor of fair use. If you're commenting on it, if you're reporting about it, if you're using it as Nancy said, if you're using it as a visual to illustrate your story, but the story is not about that video, then that leans against fair use. So a recent case that we handled dealt with this similar facts. A Facebook live stream of a gentleman videotaped his wife giving birth, and I guess didn't realize that it was streaming to 1 billion people, and that's newsworthy. And the news outlets picked up on it and reported on it and used either short clips from the video or, in my client's case, a screenshot, as I mentioned before. And the court ruled that the various uses were fair. There were news reporting, commentary, criticizing what this guy had done, and you really needed to have at least some part of the video to be able to tell that story. So in situations like that, you're more likely to get a ruling on, in favor of fair use, or an opinion in favor of fair use. But again, it's so fact specific. It's difficult to say that anything is a bright line. But that kind of gets you closer to a little bit of comfort.
Okay, great. In a similar vein, so a famous musician has died, and your client wants to make a documentary about that musician's life, and wants to use several clips of the musician's music and music videos to show, obviously, the biography of the musician, but also the musician's influence on popular music. What kinds of considerations would you make of the use of the music or the music videos?
I think at the outset, music use and licensing is a whole different scenario. I mean, it obviously it's copyrighted, it's copyrightable, it falls within the fair use analysis, but there is a very technical and multi-layered licensing system for music. So if you're going to license music to use it in a video, there are a lot of channels you have to go through. You could probably have an entire panel, if not an entire day, or maybe even an entire event dedicated to music licensing. But just with respect to the fair use aspect of this, if you're using the music to illustrate a point or document historical significance of a song or of an era, you're getting closer to fair use than if you're just using it as background music. If you're doing a documentary about, rock and roll in the 90s, and you just throw a Pearl Jam song or a Soundgarden song in there in the background, that's edging away from fair use. Whereas if you're doing a documentary about one of those bands and there's a significant song that you want to place in historical context, you may have an argument. But again, music is difficult. There's a lot of litigation in music. There are a lot of cases on sampling, cases that have found sampling is not fair use. So you're getting into slightly more dangerous territory with music. But again, if it's in the proper context and it's being used for a different purpose than the original song was intended for, you might have an argument.
Yeah, I think an important initial question is, are you commenting on the music or using it purely for entertainment value in the...
Right, yeah, and that goes to the point of kind of background music or you just using it purely for the aesthetic is the wrong word, but because it's the value of it, right? The enjoyment factor of having the music in the background, as opposed to commenting on the significance of that song or its placement in the history of music.
And the law journal that started the whole transformative movement was by Judge Pierre Laval, and he started the idea based on biographies and how you always may need to quote from someone's work in order to give a truthful biography about someone. So I think whether it's a few phrases from a book or a small portion of a song, if it's put in that context, if in a biographical nature, if you're saying this is like the most important work someone did and had a few moments of it, that would lean in favor. But if you're going to play the whole thing for the enjoyment value, that would be different.
Yeah. So keeping with the music theme, if your clients made a documentary about a painter and there are shots of the painter working in his studio and there happens to be some jazz music on in the background while the painter is painting, how would you analyze that?
Well, like as Scott just said, music, there's sort of the courts are less forgiving with the amount of music you use, perhaps, than with visual works. But I think if the music is almost indistinguishable and you can't hear it and very faint, I would sort of just be comfortable because that's the authentic environment in which this artist worked. But if you could really tell what it was and hear it, what I would recommend is that, if possible, when you're interviewing someone, probably ask them not to have strong music in the background or anything like that, but perhaps just get some licensable music that you could use in its place. Because when you're doing a documentary, you have a low budget in many cases, and music clearances take a really long time, and they can be very expensive. So I would, look at the context and see how prominent it was.
Just one thing I want to add, it's a little bit outside the documentary context, but just in terms of the risks of using background music in general. You may or may not have heard about a case called Lens, I guess, versus Universal Music. This is the dancing baby case. A mother put up a YouTube video of her, her toddler dancing to Prince's "Let's Go Crazy," and you could hear it in the background, but like not really. It wasn't totally clear. And this was on YouTube, and it was subject to a takedown notice by the copyright owner. The mother challenged it, tried to get it back up, and it ended up in a whole federal litigation that went up on appeal. And there were issues of not only of fair use, but to what extent somebody needs to engage in a fair use review before sending a takedown notice. So background music can. Don't assume that because it's in the background, it's not significant and somebody might not notice it, because people, rightfully so, police their copyrights, and they have systems for detecting things on the internet and tracking things on platforms like YouTube, and you can kind of lead down a rabbit hole that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Yeah. So keeping with the background concept, but moving to some visual works. Let's say you have a documentary about the homelessness issue in Los Angeles, and the filmmaker is interviewing an individual walking down the street, and there happens to be a large-scale mural or graffiti work behind the interview subject for a long shot.
Murals and graffiti. I think they've been in my life for the last few years. At one time, graffiti artists were, always went by their alias, and no one never wanted to be known. But they've been quite good lately at identifying their work and finding lawyers who like to bring claims on their behalf. So, they don't care if they're known as like A-hole sniffs glue, but they will sue in their legal name.
That's a tag, not
that's a tag,
not an opinion.
Not an opinion, right? So
sorry, a handle. I think maybe that's the right word for it. I don't know. An alias.
So right, a tag, right? So a pseudonym. So you have to be much more careful with background graffiti and murals than you ever used to be. So if you're doing a documentary and the neighborhood is relevant, and the person, if this homeless person actually lived on that street and that was part of the environment, if you briefly saw it in the background, that could be considered fair use because it's just incidental, and I wouldn't want to have the camera pan just on the graffiti and only look at that. Because even though it's graffiti, it's still a work of visual art and protected by copyright. So if the interviewer wanted the graffiti just for the aesthetic quality and thought that interviewing the homeless person walking down a street that only had graffiti, and that was sort of really sort of done purposely, and there was no reason, and that you weren't going to be commenting on the neighborhood and the fact that it was filled in graffiti. I would feel more uncomfortable with that, and really want to find out like why they selected that street and what was the significance of it. And I would encourage, you know, not to focus just on the artwork unless you're commenting on the artwork.
So another background use case, a documentarian has done a story about a dancer and her life and uses some family home video of her dancing as a child. And in the background of the family's home video, there are posters of dancers.
Okay, so this is where you get into, is it fleeting and de minimis, or is it fair use? And you know, when you do a documentary that's biographical, you're always going to get material from families that have been collected. And if you're going to, you know, in this case, this hypothetical, if you're in a dance studio, there's going to be certain things on a wall that's going to make the room look like a dance studio because that's the way it was. It isn't set dressing on a television show where you purposely selected certain art. But this was probably done 20 or 30 years ago. This was where the now prima ballerina grew up. And my opinion, if you can't really recognize it and it's fleeting and it's just part of the environment, that would either be de minimis or fair use. If the the camera isn't like focusing on it, and if it was, I would just sort of cut out those portions. Because you really can't go back and edit someone's real life. And if it really is incidental and background, it would seem really unfortunate if you could not be able to tell a complete story because of some blurry pictures on the wall. But you need to do the analysis because visual artists are very good at identifying their work, even though you are not. And even if you are correct, the problem with any claim is that when you get insurance, there's going to be a deductible, and you're going to have to pay a certain amount before the insurance kicks in. So there may be times where you, as a business decision, may just pay some type of license fee and get a settlement just to avoid legal costs. So.